Is it okay to try?
Yeah, let's try now again, and then I might have to leave and come back. But we'll see. Okay, we'll try one more time, and then if not, I'll leave and then come back. Oh, looks promising. Okay, sweet.
I think you got it.
Working? Okay, cool. All right. So this was an interesting one for me because I, yeah, have been here and I feel like I know the land really well and like, well as you can for being somewhere for like 5 years. And actually looking at the maps and connecting some of the dots, yeah, some things revealed themselves to me that I didn't necessarily think about already. So thank you for the invitation on this, Brandon. I do really appreciate the opportunity to delve a little more deeply into this, especially with some folks who may not be as familiar with the region as me. So yeah, I was trying to dance around a little bit and figure out what to even call this area. I think the boundaries started to become a little more clear over the mapping process, but there's still, I think, some uncertainty around the naming. So I just settled on the upper Rio Grande for now. The river is very much like a defining characteristic of this region. This picture that you guys are seeing now is just outside of Taos, and as you can see, it just completely dominates the landscape. So let's continue on. So figured I'd get two birds stoned with one scone to start out with and do a little land acknowledgement while also illustrating just the complicated nature of this place. So the lower left-hand corner there is from this website called Native Land, and it's a really good one if you guys haven't played around with that. It kind of gives you these different overlapping layers of traditional indigenous territory. And yeah, I feel like this one and then the more colorful one kind of complemented each other really well. So where I'm at, this northern part of New Mexico, Taos County, is in the traditional lands of the Diné, the Tewa, the Pueblo people, the Ute, the Comanche, the Jicarilla Apache, and the Cheyenne. Kind of, you can see this convoluted mess over there. It's complicated. There's a lot of overlapping territories. There's a lot of these groups using specific parts of the region seasonally. There's some of them that maintained their position throughout the year round. The image in the back there is Taos Pueblo, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously inhabited place in North America. It was built around the year 1200, and people have been living there continuously since then. But there was a lot of intermingling in this region historically. This was kind of always a region of this like kind of cultural exchange, kind of infusion of different ways of being into different groups. One example of that, this mountain range, kind of, you can see where in that lower left map where all the overlapping is. That's kind of like the northern extremes of Taos County. This is where horses were first introduced to the indigenous people of North America through the Spaniards. So this is really like the epicenter of the development of the horse culture that became such a prominent feature in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So there's a local spot here right where that like really busy intersection is, called Ute Mountain, that was historically just a spot where the Ute, Comanche, and Pueblo folks would get together every year to kind of convene and trade goods and catch up. It would make it kind of like a regular check-in sort of thing. And then just to the north of that, where there's still the overlap, is the San Luis Valley. And that was kind of referred to as like the Bloodless Valley back in the day, because it was just such a pleasant place to hang out. People kind of had this unspoken agreement that there would be no conflict there. And yeah, over to the more colorful map, you can kind of see the bigger one is the Southwest as a whole. And then when you zoom in, you start to see just the granularity of this particular region, like all of the different Pueblo groups kind of nestled next to each other down the Rio there. It was some of the largest concentration of like permanent settlements in pre-colonization North America. And you know, a lot of another interesting bit about this region is a lot of these groups have maintained a good portion of their ancestral homelands. The Taos Pueblo has sovereignty over their entire watershed. Basically, they have from the headwaters and source of the river that flows through the Pueblo all the way down to close to where it drains into the Rio Grande. So that continuity, I feel like, is an interesting feature. And then here, that's Ute Mountain in the background, the mountain I was just talking about, is what seems to me to be like the dominant geological feature of this region. This is the Rio Grande Rift. It's essentially a thin spot in the continental crust where the Colorado Plateau is pulling away from the high plains, creating these series of basins that go all the way down to the border of Mexico, pretty much. And it's curious in a way because these basins were only relatively recently have they become like a single integrated hydrological system. So how it kind of worked is the Rio would empty into the basin and just completely fill it up full of sediments and kind of hang out there for extended periods of time, accumulating sediments, acting as kind of like a playa. And then through these specific events, they would break through and integrate into each of the following basins. And yeah, something that's really interesting I found with this is specifically the San Luis Basin, where I'm based out of. Is one of the few instances I've seen where the like kind of linear state line boundary actually kind of corresponds with the landscape. Like just about 15 miles north of where that state line is where the gorge, which you can see in the background here, the river kind of follows this rift and carves into this like 800, 900 foot deep in some places gorge. And that really begins right before the river flows into New Mexico. And the northern part, I guess the southern part of that basin is dominated by this volcanic field, this Taos volcanic field of old volcanoes that pepper this like relatively high stage step plateau situation, and Ute Mountain is one of those. That also kind of begins right at the state line too, so I found that pretty interesting. Yeah, it's curious how it does really just extend all the way down the river, you know, until you get down to that Chihuahuan Desert in northern Texas, southern New Mexico. And yeah, going from there, it just kind of made sense to focus on the subcontinental scale of the watershed as well. The Rio it's very similar to the Colorado River in that it's the other like large river system in the Southwest and shares like a lot of the same issues. It's actually hydrologically connected too. You can see up in that corner right there, that little turquoise line, right near the headwaters, there's actually a major transbasin diversion. The San Juan Chama project pulls off a sizable amount of water from the San Juan River, one of the upper reaches of the Colorado, and brings it over into the Rio Grande Basin. And that is actually Albuquerque's main source of water there. So not natural, but it is an interesting thread tying together the two fates of these river basins. And yeah, there's, depending on how you measure it, this is either the Rio Grande watershed is either slightly larger or smaller than the Colorado. One of the things this map doesn't picture that's super interesting is right in the middle here between the Pecos River and the main stem of the Rio Grande, there's a pretty extensive series of endoheric basins, these closed watersheds that don't have any outlets. They just, all of the water drains in and then either evaporates or is used for agriculture. You can see over here in this smaller map too, there's one right up at the headwaters there. This is the Sawatch Basin. And a lot of this water that enters this basin is kind of pumped out to the rest of the San Luis Valley there for agriculture. But yeah, as I was saying, there's a lot of shared issues between here and the Colorado River. constant over allocation for both for agriculture, urban use, pretty long history of land degradation. And yeah, one of the interesting features about the watershed of the Rio is that you can see over here in the upper one, this whole flat area right here is the San Luis Valley. This is very intensive agriculture. It's the largest alpine valley in the world. It's about 50 miles wide by 100 miles long, and it's about 8,000 feet and very arid, about 8 inches of precipitation a year. And you'll see here these massive center pivot irrigation systems, the types of irrigation that appears, those giant circles from a satellite view. And that's really the only area in this region where that's possible. You typically see them more in the plains where there's a lot more flat area, but it's a curious dynamic because it's really close to the headwaters. It's this pretty sensitive area, and being so extensively used and using so much water there, they've been dealing with some issues in the past. They do a lot of groundwater pumping, and they basically have been told like they need to find a different source of water, which there really isn't one at this point. So they have, I think the state gave them like 10 or 15 years to figure it out before they start shutting off wells. So all the farmers up there are kind of in the spot where they're really kind of scrambling to figure out what to do next. And then one more thing to comment on about the watershed here, which is really interesting. You have this curious feature here where there's this north-south gradient extending from like a more temperate region to the rain shadow kind of like arid zones in the south that also corresponds with the elevational gradient. So this being the highest part of the watershed, getting progressively lower as you go down, there's a pretty dramatic variation between the upper reaches. And then when you get down to this broader section down here, by the point that you get down past El Paso, historically the river is dry in the summer months. And it's not until you get to the Rio Conchos that the riverbed actually has water in it again. So yeah, and then another curious thing about this, there's a little bit of the international situation at play with the Colorado River, but it's like 1,000 miles here where the river actually forms a US-Mexico border. So in terms of water management and all of the interesting dynamics there, it's this whole real complicated factor once you get down south past El Paso. This is pretty good. Okay. And this is where I kind of hang out and spend most of my time trying to make sense of this region. This is the USDA ecoregions map, the level 4 ecoregions, and I'll kind of just give you a little ID here so you can see what we're working with. So you see in the green here, this is all the Southern Rockies, and this is where the Rockies either end or begin, depending on your perspective. This kind of creates this, edge that extends all the way up to the to the Canadian Rockies, this like continuous stretch of related habitat. To the east here, you have the southwestern tablelands, which are kind of like this transition zone between the southwest and the high plains. That's this pink area here too, but I view these two sections as being quite distinct because you can kind of see here it's the central rift zone where the Rio Grande is the dominant feature is pretty enclosed by the mountains. Like you really do feel a sense of being kind of like nestled in this landscape when you're in here, and that kind of loses its effect as you get farther down south and you transition. These mountains down here, these are the Arizona, New Mexico mountains, or the Sky Islands. I like that name quite a bit better. And you can see once you get past the southern boundary of the Jemez and the Sangre de Cristo range there, it really opens up and you don't have that same sort of sense. Not only that, you don't have this connectivity between the two of the different kind of ecoregions. It's there's a lot of wildlife corridors and animal movement up and down the mountain ranges, and the kind of elevational gradient movement up from all the way up to tree line, these kind of like wider bits here, and down into these lower basins. That's a pretty seasonally important thing, but it's not it's not as prominent here as it is for these sky islands because of the lack of connectivity between the larger mountain system. And then you can see over here, right in that corner, I cut out most of it, but this is the Colorado Plateau, and the Continental Divide runs through here too. So you get this like kind of like drainage to the east on this side, drainage to the west on that side. But the edges of these of the Rockies have quite different character depending on which other adjoining ecoregion they butt up against. Yeah, it's curious in that you'll basically the only forests that we have here are in these higher elevation areas, either the Sky Islands or the Southern Rockies, or in the riparian areas along the actual river systems, except for pinon and juniper. You'll see our pinon pine kind of like pop up in random places. It can handle the more marginal conditions. Right. I think, yeah, and then this is the cultural bit that I feel like is just so important. And I wasn't able to find a really good map illustrating kind of like the region as a whole about this, but this is actually where I'm currently sitting and talking to you down in Valdez there. And these are the acequia systems that I feel like are a very key cultural component of this bioregion. So it's these communally managed ditch irrigation systems that were established in collaboration between the indigenous groups and the Hispanic settlers who came over here in the early 17th century. And it's this community-based sharing of the water, essentially. It's all completely in counterbalance to the typical Western prior appropriation doctrine of water law, the sort of like first in time, first in right thing. These systems are set up to where everyone equally shares the amount of water that's available. And they have this really interesting feature to them where they create an extension of the naturally occurring riparian ecosystems. So instead of just having all of the water concentrated along this main stem here, it's diverted and spread out. And flood irrigation is the typically most common use of these. But what will happen is you can see it really well here. People will irrigate their fields, opening the acequia, flood their entire field, and then the overflow will spill back in to the main stem of the river. So instead of just having this narrow little band of more lush, more obligate like wetland species there, you have that same effect kind of spread out over a much larger area. Really, really interesting feature of this whole region. And that's actually why I ended up here, is because I wanted to farm and couldn't get water in Colorado. All of the cities had bought up all of the water rights and kind of like prior appropriated them as there were. But this is an interesting feature of here, because it does really kind of create this like tension balance between the needs of the community and the demands of these urban areas. And there's this like dynamic tension between actually needing people to be on the land, using the water, engaging with the acequia systems. Otherwise, cities will start to kind of like take note of it and be like, hey, that water is not being used. Like, we can kind of like put this prior appropriation business in there and be like, okay, so this water's not being used, it's coming downstream to us, like we want to use it. So that's like a really interesting feature I've found here. There's a sense of like needing people to be on the land actively working it. But it's like, this is historically a pretty poor region, and a lot of people who grow up here will leave for the cities for more opportunity and more economic viability. But it is this really like, yeah, interesting dance here too. So I think that's it. Yeah. And one thing that I kind of just wanted to end with mentioning is there's this Spanish word that gets tossed around a lot here, querencia, and it comes from the root querer, the word to want or to love something, and it basically refers to this like this deep love of one's home stemming from being so like firmly rooted in a place that you kind of like integrate and become part of it. And yeah, that's like very, very alive here. Like the people who are here and have been here for many, many generations, like have a very very deep love of this land, but that also comes with some distrust of outsiders. Like one of the big things about here is that you really kind of have to show that you're committed and want to be doing good work and like actually are trying to integrate into the community instead of just like coming in and enjoying the scenery as this kind of like backdrop to your existence. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, that was great.
But as you can see, it's a little tricky to draw those exact boundaries. Oh yeah, that's one thing I didn't mention with the ecoregions map is down at the end there where the two mountain ranges kind of taper out, and you get to Albuquerque. Right below that, it transitions to the Chihuahuan Desert. So you start in this like semi-arid ecology up top on the valley floors, and then as you wind down, you start entering in to the true desert, and that kind of feels like a harder edge to me. But yeah, as you can see, like I have a decent handle on the broad scale image here, but like when it gets to like focusing on those more discrete boundaries of the bioregion, that's where I start to kind of like grapple with some issues. Like first I thought the acequias would be like a pretty defining feature of it, but there's some isolated acequia systems like all the way down close to the international border, and they're like clustered in this kind of like small regions where there is enough live water year round to make it viable, but that definition doesn't necessarily work. And then culturally, like it's all very, there's a continuity from all the way to the top, like all the way down to, you know, the bottom of the watershed, really. But ecologically, it's just so distinct. So yeah, lots of questions doing this kind of like open up more questions than I already had, but I feel like that's kind of a good sign.
Yeah. Thank you. Are you taking questions?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very informative. And I remember in another session, you saying that you tend to focus on the smaller scale, and when it comes to the larger scale, things can get a bit overwhelming. I'm paraphrasing and perhaps not duly interpreting what you said, but I thought you said something like that. And this strikes me to be pretty large scale. So can you elaborate on what scale means to you?
Yeah. I think
Navigation between the scales, and also a bit about your research process, because I think that could speak to how we could, others could learn about their own regions. So.
totally. I think it might have been the inverse actually. It was a comment I left in the cultural evolution webinar that Joe gave on Saturday, which I'm going to go watch after this. But yeah, so I for me, it's a lot easier to be out at these larger scales and kind of see these like landscape level processes and actually witness, on these broad like geological time patterns, like how the land organizes itself. And then when you get down to the specifics of it, and like actually get on the ground and like start trying to parse things out, that's when it becomes a little more complicated for me. Like the broad scale, the kind of like bird's eye view, I tend to do pretty well hanging out there. That's where I'm comfortable. But like bringing that in to like a community dialogue setting, for example, like that's the part that I kind of have an interesting time dancing with, because I'm like, how much context do I give? Like I've been studying this stuff for several years, and it's like how fundamental do I need to get with it? And that's one of the things that I really get out of Joe's style of presentation is that like he will somehow be able to weave these like incredibly complicated and dense topics in a way that like is relatively easy to follow and like kind of like starts from that place of common ground. Yeah, and then in terms of the research portion of it, like a lot of this stuff was already in my like field of awareness. It was just a matter of like tracking down the individual maps, which surprisingly difficult. Like the ecoregions one is kind of like my my home base, and that's where I like kind of like start from a lot of the times. But there's a lot of pieces that I wish I would have had there. Like I know there's a nonprofit group that's been working on mapping all of the acequias. And that would have been really nice to have, but I did quite a bit of digging and I couldn't quite find it. So yeah. What can you like elaborate a little bit more about the research process bit? I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Well, what you presented was very informative. So obviously there's work that went into it, and apparently not just work over a weekend, like you just said. This is over the course of a few years, because you strike me as very knowledgeable about the region. So
Thank you.
how does one begin that? Yeah.
Well, that's kind of like that's my like academic background. Like I got a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science in this region. I was up in Denver, but in the Southern Rockies. So kind of being immersed in that process in like an ecoregion that had components that kind of transfer down here. That's how I really like started off with that kind of solid foundation. But a lot of the more locally specific information I've gotten has been from doing my best to like integrate myself into the community. Like I worked for this old timer up here who's kind of like the local witch who'd been gardening here for like 40 years, and kind of just like bouncing stuff off of her while I was doing some work for her was a big part. And like the connections I made through the other people she would have coming through was how I got a lot of the information that's not necessarily just like available. And that's one of the things that is like kind of tricky around here. So couldn't really find a good map about it, but like one of the dominant features of the cultural landscape here is this kind of like multi-layering of waves of settlement. Like the ancestral Puebloans, the people of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and all of that, after the big mega drought in the early, like 1300s, they all migrated eastward and actually settled the Pueblos on the Rio Grande. I think there's 19 of them going from Taos all the way down to El Paso almost. So you have that, and then early 1600s, you have the kind of movement of the Hispanic settlers up from Mexico and establishing these, traditional Hispanic farming communities. And then in the early 1900s, you have really this influx of Anglos after, the Mexican-American War. And like, there was some time for that to settle. There was a big push of Anglos into the region. So you have these different layers and different, traumas associated with that, like those multiple aspects of colonization. Obviously, the first one, the kind of navigating between the Hispanic and the indigenous folks, there was like some degree of cooperation, like the establishment of the acequia systems. But then after the Mexican-American War, and there were all these Anglos coming in, like, swindling these Hispanic settlers out of their historic land grants. There's like a whole level of like bureaucratic fuckery that went on there that's like pretty insidious. So there's a lot of mistrust, and there's a lot of challenge in coming in as an outsider, as someone who's like not from here, and wanting to learn more about the region and wanting to like integrate. It takes like this kind of like hazing period. Like I've been here for about 5 years and just continually showing up to events and like talking to people. Like just now I'm making some headway into the trust required to receive some of this information. So a lot of it has just been like persistence. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
All right. I want to leave room for other questions too, but if I may sneak another one in here. There's a book called Fire in the Mind, which is, if you ever came across that, but it's by a science writer. It's a really intriguing history, not just the cultural history, but the ways of thinking across the centuries, because the Southwest is layering, native Spanish and Anglo paradigms and, forms of life and economies over centuries. And it's a very rich and complicated tapestry, and that book is pretty fascinating. Another is just so in how to tell stories. I'm realizing the importance of like you mentioned. So Joe, for example, does very well at painting a relatable story that's also born out of the science. And I'm interested in, I also have a scientific background in socio-ecological systems, and looking for ways to like take that information as use it as a way to explain in relatable terms like these topics. So so one thing is how to connect the scales, and in the scales in resilience think. I'm actually reading or rereading this book. Claire, you might be familiar with Brian Walker. Yeah, so this is great. Giving case studies drawn from ecology on like the ecology of systems using resilience and complex adaptive systems as a framework. And one thing there is like showing how small scale like attempts to keep a system intact or to maximize productivity at one scale can lead to pathologies at another. And as I look to tell that larger story, it's not just the interesting story, but showing why it's important to tell it at that scale for those reasons. So I'm interested, and I tossed this by Anna, but having like an Earth Regenerators, we have a book club, something like that, but it's actually focused on discussion around literature, and more focused. Maybe we can look at papers or short books like this, and actually dive into the theory and the case studies. It's I mean, I still get so much from Joe, and to take it to the next level requires a little bit of studying. So not everybody's going to be interested in that kind of thing. I know that I am, and other people might be. So if there is interest in having like a paper club or something like that, I'd be part of that. Just putting that out there.
Sweet.
I think that would be really awesome, actually. Is yeah, exactly what you're saying. Yeah. Would that be a good book? Like, is there a good book that you would bring forward for doing that?
Yeah.
The resilience, yeah. Is that that is by Brian?
Yeah, Brian Walker and David Salt.
Because they're such good communicators anyway. And the storytelling is really good.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. And just to jump back to your presentation, Bennett, yeah, I think you killed it. I really liked, I thought you did a wonderful job. So thank you for bringing that presentation. And it certainly gives me a better understanding of the Rio and kind of the area that you're in. I love that you started with the geology and then kind of worked your way down. And what you're talking about, I do think that what's nice is that like a lot of that area, it's like that bare bone geology. And so it really does create some pretty coherent, you're able to look at things and it really does emerge. And that's like a really nice, nice thing. And I would just say that, you know, if you're struggling, because you kind of, you take it down to the eco-regional level, and then the kind of like, and I really love the incorporation of traditional indigenous groups, practices, irrigation techniques. And yeah, from what I remember in the Southwest, it like, yeah, they had such a great, like even like the Pueblo Indians, you know, I think in the 800s and 900s had that like really disparate form of agriculture because the rain would come in different places every year and they never knew where it would be. So everybody would farm, and then wherever it rained, they would like share the bounty of it because next year it could be totally different. And I just think that it was like a really interesting and unique setup. And so it was really cool to see how that continues into modern day as well. And if you're struggling with the like kind of with the cultural connections, what I would say is that's a really good opportunity to bring in the human layers, the human geography, and let that guide where you think those overlaps are, because sometimes it'll make sense, sometimes it won't, but especially like with water usage, it's going to be like you see it with the Colorado where they're like pipelines are going off and all the rest of it. And so we change our environments. And obviously this is also about creating coherent systems for the people, as well as the plants, animals, ecosystems within these bioregional frameworks. So I would be really curious too of my question for you, I think, is what do you feel like that there's a connection that would need to be made between like I see such similarities between like the Rio, you have like the Rio and the Colorado River coming down in terms of like culture that's been created, whether it's like traditional indigenous culture or like modern, like there's such a Southwest identity. Do you feel like those things kind of go together, or like what about like Texas? Like, you got Texas right there. Is that totally separate, or do you feel like that there's a lot of like integration and cultural identity that weaves those areas together? Is there like a lot of shared land use, water use, cultural stuff? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can speak from my experience in like the greater Southwest to some degree. Like when I moved down here from Colorado, one of the things that I noticed was this like very, very big difference in terms of the just demographics. Like there's Arizona, Colorado, there's a sizable portion of people of Hispanic descent, especially in Arizona. Like the farther south you get, the more prevalent that is. But New Mexico is actually a minority majority state. One of the only other ones, I think, outside it's us and Alaska. And that's partially the Hispanic descent. That's partially the indigenous population. But that's something that I feel like is just very prevalent here that is not necessarily so much in most of Colorado and Arizona. Colorado, you do have the San Luis Valley, which is kind of like that northernmost extension of the rift, and that kind of like connection to the land, I think, is the really key bit here. Like there's a continuity from the original settlers of this land that like continues through this day, even in the indigenous groups. Like for instance, the Navajo Nation, which is like mostly over in Arizona, some of it extends into New Mexico, is like they were like they're pastoral people. Like they ran giant herds of sheep, and they ranged over a huge area. Their reservation is the largest, but it encompasses just like a tiny fraction of their historical land use. And to go back to kind of like the Pueblo examples, like Taos and like some of the other Rio Grande Pueblos are the only examples I know of where the actual reservation territory corresponds largely with their like ancestral areas of use. Obviously, there's much more of this region that, like you were saying, with the farming techniques, they kind of cast a pretty broad net. There's much more of this region that they historically use, but in terms of having like the actual gradient from the valley floor all the way up to tree line and having access to those different resources and different plant communities along the way, I think that's like a key feature that defines this particular area centered on the Rio Grande and makes it distinct from bigger portions of the Southwest. There's definitely like a thread of culture and like kind of like the aesthetic, like you're saying, that I feel is prominent in other regions outside of this one, but I feel like it's almost like more polished and like presentable outside of this region. I'll give another example of something I noticed here that kind of like speaks to that. Specifically in Taos, this was like the really like the hinterlands of New Spain, and it was the end of supply chain, still is to this day. Kind of like really tucked away back here. Like there's people didn't come here unless they were specifically going here, and there's, I think, this mentality, you know, almost in living memory still, of there being a need to really kind of just like make it work with what you have. There's this kind of like aesthetic around here. It's like you're not really like a proper norteño unless you have like a couple of junked out cars on your property. It's just like people will keep every last little scrap of things just on the off chance that they might need it, because there was such a drive to just do that and make it work with whatever was available around here back when the, you know, the goods couldn't necessarily be guaranteed. And yeah, it's kind of off-putting to people who come in and want just like this nice clean image of seeing all these people with like just their entire worldly possessions sprawled out on their property. It's yeah, it's kind of like a interesting thing to fixate on, but like it was very obvious to me when I moved here, and then I started like getting a sense of things and being like, oh, okay, this is just how it is. And a lot of people will like be kind of off put by that, but it makes sense when you think about just how isolated this region was historically. Did I answer your question? I feel like I kind of went off.
I think that was great. And I think it's really interesting, like you're saying, it's really cool that you feel like that there's this coherence from, you know, from the top all the way down to the bottom, because I know that that's very different than Colorado, where there's really struggling to have this, like, you know, this connection between the headwaters and the lower portions. And so I'm always kind of interested in where that coherence is or doesn't exist. So I think that that's really wonderful. Does anybody else have any like last questions for Bennett?